It's almost always preferable not to change. However, there are some changes that are completely fine. So, for example, if you are an engineer that works for Boeing and you decide to go work for a different aerospace company, or even a completely non-aerospace company, but you're an engineer, you're performing similar tasks, and you go from salary to salary, no problem at all, right? You can. Now, the longer the gap between jobs, that could create a problem. If your gap between the one job and the other job is, let's say, 6 months or more, then there's going to need to be an explanation. But even then, generally, as long as you're going from a fixed salary position to a fixed, or even if you're going from an hourly into a fixed salary position, that's really what's key. You're going into a fixed salary position, so it's
in the same line of work.
Generally, but it doesn't necessarily, and that can be very broadly construed.
Yeah.
Line of work can be very broadly construed, and so if you're an office manager for a real estate company and you become office manager for the septic company, that's the same line of work. You're an office manager, and if you're salaried in one, you go to a salary to another, you're fine. Where you run into problems is even in a salaried situation. Let's say you're salaried and you go to salary. Let's say you work for a food distribution company and your salary plus bonus, you go to work for the major competitor of that food distribution company, same line of work, same job, salary plus bonus. That could be a problem if you need the bonus to qualify, because the bonus is the variable component. And that's the thing that underwriting now has some questions to answer as to, okay, you used to earn this bonus over here, and we see what the terms of your employment are, but you don't have a history of earning the bonus here. You earned it here. Yeah. And so that's where you could run into trouble. You certainly can run into trouble if you go from salary to hourly, or even hourly to hourly. Let's say you work at Fred Meyer's and then you go to work for Safeway, and you've been working at Fred Meyer's and you work at $22 an hour, but by nature most of those jobs are hourly and variable. And maybe you've been working 40 hours a week and maybe even overtime, but now you move to a new job. There's no guaranteed number of hours.
And does that matter if you were at Fred Meyer for a year or 2 years and then you end up at that new place?
It does matter. They will have an easier time if you go from Fred Meyer's to Safeway. You'll still have a harder time using bonus income or overtime income or those sorts of things because you don't have the pattern at the new place. And so you'll still have a hard time. But if you have 2 years history at Fred Meyer's and then you go to Safeway, you'll probably be able to use your base salary at some historical work average, as long as there's some indication in the new work.
So if you make that move, because what I hear a lot of times, or see asked a lot of times, is the 2-year rule, which I would guess is more of just kind of you're very safe if you have that 2 years kind of thing, but doesn't mean you can't qualify with that income before. So what if you have been at Fred Meyer's, who knows, a year, then you shift over to Safeway, you've been there a year, and then you apply for a loan. How's that income going to be counted?
Well, again, your base pay, hourly pay, as long as you have a history. Basically, if you move from Fred Meyer to Safeway, and then ever since you started Safeway, your hours have gone down a little bit that whole time. You've gradually gone from, Freddy's, you were working 40 hours a week, plus some overtime. At Safeway, you started at 40, but for the last 2 months now you've been at 30. You see that decline, that could be a problem. But generally, if you're working that same pattern and you can support that pattern, then you're probably going to be fine. Where you also run into trouble is if you go from let's say you go from a salary position to self-employed. That's a real challenge. There are some very rare exceptions where if you're in a position where you're moving into self-employment, doing the exact same thing, serving the exact same companies, and maybe have some contracts to back that up, then maybe you'll get an underwriter to buy that income. But generally, if you move from employed by somebody else to self-employed, you're going to need probably 2 years, and that's 2 tax returns. You might be able to get away with 1, but you're probably going to need to count on 2 tax returns in order to qualify. Or if you move from salary to hourly, you move from salary to hourly, and that can be a challenge as well. You had this salary, and if you move into an hourly position where the employer will vouch that you are guaranteed a certain minimum of hours a week, then they'll probably give you that as well.